and our community partners. We put together the outline and created the course and continue to update it all the time. So this CAL FIRE funding for us will go through 2027, and we're actively seeking additional funding to expand throughout the rest of the state. Next slide, please. So the Learning Center is where everyone's going to take your exam and certificate. This is a brand new website that we just added to our whole portfolio. So you, I think, are the 4th class that's participating in the Learning Center. So we've worked out most of the kinks, and it'll be fairly easy to click through and get your certificate. So there'll be a survey that we'll ask you to fill out, and that's, again, just getting information for our grants that we report back to CAL FIRE, and then you'll see some resources there. You'll have a copy of the slide deck that you can use during the exam. There's no time limit, and you can take it up to 3 times. If you're still having trouble, just email me, let me know. We want you to get certified. That's our goal. And so you'll get all these instructions emailed to you after we close the class today. Next slide, please. So please take a minute to scan this attendance. I know you've already filled out an Eventbrite registration, but we're going to have you fill this out one more time just in case your email you used for Eventbrite is different than what you're logging on with today. And this will be the email I use to send you the exam link. So please get your email onto this list. And next slide, please. Well, actually, let's maybe go back and leave that one for a second.
Go ahead.
Yeah, can you go? Nope. Can you go back to the QR code? Yeah, just leave that for a second. If you're watching from your phone, I recommend taking a screenshot. I will also drop the direct link into the chat. Let me do that right now while you are scanning. Okay, it is now there in the chat. If you are not able to scan the QR code, thank you all. Okay. So you have 2 weeks to take your exam. So the deadline, let's see, is going to be, I'm going to take a look at the calendar. Let's do the 22nd. So Friday the 22nd is when the exam deadline will be, and you just go in and get your certificate through the website, and then get yourself into the professional directory and hopefully come back for another class. All right, we can go to the next slide, and I think we can skip this one since we just talked about that. And finally, the most important part of the evening, I'd like to introduce our instructors for tonight. Feel free to unmute yourself, Diana, and introduce yourself to the class.
Hey everyone, my name is Diana. I've been working with the RCD for about 6 months now. I'm a home ignition zone evaluator. I go out and do wildfire assessments in the LA area. So yeah, nice to meet you all.
Thank you. And go ahead, Ryan, take it away.
And I am Ryan. I've been with the RCD for a few years, and I'm also a home ignition zone evaluator. And I do some environmental education at our state parks with the RCD as well. And I am in control of the presentation, so I will go forward from here, and we will begin with our first section, which is going to cover wildfires and all the different kinds. And for the rest of the Zoom as well, we are going to cover wildland fires and their difference from other kinds of wildfires. A wildland fire is different than a wildfire, and we're going to look at them from multiple perspectives, including historical data and the factors that contribute to them. We're going to discuss how wildland urban interfaces and fire hazard severity zones impact wildfire defense practices and what defensible spaces are. We're going to cover the different zones, how we can utilize resources, and a brief overview of landscape design and vegetation by zone. So let's begin. By thinking home first when it comes to fire mitigation, we are able to accomplish so much. I'm sure maybe some of you are familiar with the term home hardening, which is wildfire mitigation, getting it away from the home. And that's what us as an agency and typical civilians can do for their homes to prevent fires from spreading. And the effort should also include maintenance, design, and recovery. So let's take a look at some of the biggest fires that have occurred in the state. So what stands out to you on this chart? Out of the 20 fires here, 18 of them have occurred in the last decade. So as you see here, most of them have occurred in the 2000s, minus this Matia fire. And we have the causes in parentheses here. Notice that some of them are undetermined. I believe we have 2 undetermined ones right here and here. The rest have been confirmed as human related or lightning. And things like power lines falling down, that is human made infrastructure. But nonetheless, let's focus on 2020, which was a really big year for wildfires in the state of California, and the challenge that we faced as a world, as well as a ecosystem, as fires were they tore down more than 2.5 million acres that year. As you know, wildfires are extremely destructive. Let's look at another perspective here. The 2020 wildfire season also became one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So here it is. So we're going to begin with ignition because that's how fires begin. While ignition can happen naturally, it has also been present in our environment far longer than humans have. Most modern day ignition is caused by humans, some of them being campfires, smoking, equipment sparks, down power lines, arson, things that would produce embers that could escape with wind can cause wildfires. Some natural causes are a dry climate, lightning, and volcanoes. After a heat source has sparked a local fire, wildfire behavior is influenced by 3 factors: fuel, topography, and weather. Embers can travel by wind and find other surfaces or fuel in the environment, thus resulting in the fire growing. As you can see in this image here, we have the embers flying off of the trees sporadically, as well as this picture, embers flying onto the patio and onto the vegetation here. Wildland fire behavior is very different than wildfire behavior in the urbanized area, or WUI, which follows more like a structure fire behavior. Urban areas overlap and intermingle with the wildland fire urban interface, which makes wildfire more dynamic.
They bring industry professionals in all the time to teach a class. So be good.
So ground fires are surface fires. No, ground fires are low-level, low-intensity fires which burn organic matter in the soil, such as peat or moss. Though they are slow-moving, it can be difficult to tell when they are completely out. They can easily turn into the next kind of fire, which is called surface fire. And both images here are prescribed, one from Colorado and one from New Mexico. So by prescribed, I mean they did this on purpose. These are both controlled, most likely by a forestry unit in those areas. And that was to clear a lot of the undergrowth and dry vegetation. And as you can see, the fire is too low to reach the crown of the tree. In surface fires, they range from low level to medium intensity, and they can burn the leaf litter, as you see here. This vegetation will act as a fire fuel. And as you see the dry branches, those can also act as a fuel ladder. And removing these and burning them will still help keep the fire away from the crown of the tree, which is this area. Crown fires, they burn through the top layer of the foliage on a tree or shrub, and that is also known as the canopy. Crown fires are the most intense and often the most difficult to contain. Strong winds, steep slopes, and a heavy fuel load help them continue burning. All fires in the chaparral are crown fires. Some say fire on the ground will blow to the crown, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the landscape since crown fires do not start from embers landing on the upper portion. Right, so an ember falling on this chaparral wouldn't start a crown fire, as these plants have resistance to fires and have nutrients and water flowing through them. Let's talk about fire regimes. A fire regime characterizes the spatial and temporal patterns and ecosystem impacts of fire on the landscape. This chart illustrates the interplay between sources of ignition, lightning strikes, or human causes. Atmospheric conditions, weather conditions are right here, resources to burn, types of vegetation and structure. Fire regimes vary in terms of intensity, geographic extent, and duration. This chart shows how interannual variability can account for year-to-year changes in fire intensity in a certain region, and how long-term climate accounts for long-term shifts in the fire regime. So these are good data points for scientists to know how fires have changed and what factors are contributing.
I have a question.
Okay.
Are fire regimes constant or are they changing right now?
I would assume they'd be changing.
Okay.
As wind and weather change, so would the fire regime, as we see. The severity of the fire does depend on the weather, and a different cause could change into, so some fires actually blend into each other. Some can start out as wildfires, some can start out as a wildland fire, and they can converge. So this fire regime would be variable. The most important factors to remember are types of vegetation, the weather, and climate patterns. The image on the right demonstrates an example of a model that incorporates the same variables within the fire regime. So that would be California A. This is our historical record of fires is this is the last 10 years of fires in the Santa Monica Mountains and the sea, the simulated model for this region. To demonstrate a fire regime in action, we can look at San Diego. So if you live in a region where wildfires occur, something like this is pretty common. We can see the differences of the interface by decade and year, and see how when a wildfire rolls in, it takes a long time for those native plants to resurface. So if fires occur more frequently, it impedes the ability for that habitat to reach a full, diverse health. The image on the left here references a portion of San Diego where conditions for large wildfires have been historically present, specifically the 1970 Laguna Fire and the 2003 Cedar Fire, which were two of the worst in San Diego and California history. This graph demonstrates the historical extent in a much more detailed manner. Records indicate that over 2/3 of the area shown are burned at least twice, with some burning as many as 10 times. So it's easy to say that none of this landscape has escaped burning. Burns have been a part of California's history, and as long as they're not too big, too frequent, they can be more controlled, and as you will see with home hardening, our safety and our belongings can be out of harm's way. With burns becoming more frequent, our landscapes. Okay. So let's take a look at climate change and how dry seasons, strong winds can affect the devastation. Okay, so now we're going to get into the difference between wildland fires versus wildfires. A wildland fire describes any non-structure fire. It is important to keep which can be helpful, these wildland fires, as it's important to keep the structure and balance of the ecosystem. Especially in California, where we get a lot of dry vegetation in the summer, it's a good idea to clear that on days that aren't windy and have a high moisture point in the atmosphere. Wildfires, on the other hand, are unplanned fires that can come in contact with urban landscapes. These fires get out of control mostly due to human influence, and much of the driving fuels of wildfires are man-made structures, not vegetation. So not the dry vegetation here. And we'll expand on this shortly. Historically, fires, like I said, common occurrence, and they occur naturally. And beginning around 75 years ago, around 1909, is when California's fire suppression tactics really started to take hold. And you would see they would not do controlled burns. They wouldn't do these wildland fires. And so that dry vegetation just built up and up. And with longer dry seasons, created more and more of potential fuel for a wildfire. let's look at the case study of the pine tree. This region in, I'm saying Northern California, contained many pine trees that were used to surface fires that intervaled around 10 to 30 years. They were able to then adapt to the fires by producing pine trees with thicker bark that would fall off towards the bottom, but the thick bark would remain viable for the water and nutrients to circulate the entire tree. So while those surface fires would run through, it kept the number of trees trying to compete for nutrients down. And these burning the soil also helps add nutrients to the soil because of the ash. After a fire in 1910, the Forest Service implemented a total suppression policy, which led to increased fuel loads, and that dry vegetation got a little out of hand. Some new species such as fir came in, and the fir acted as a ladder fuel, and that created more intensity. But we are shifting to keep to prevent fire from escalating to a point which we've actually seen more recently. This case study illustrates what has happened with much of our forested land. And we have some links to learn about chaparral because the story of chaparral is quite different. So why are fires more destructive? Well, human impact has certainly caused a bit of the extent. It's resulted in more infrastructure becoming ignition after power lines gone down or strong wind events like the last few days. Traditional practices which implemented controlled ground fires added nutrients to the soil and cleared the creeks and streams of the silt and clutter that would fall into them. If you haven't been alarmed yet as to the increase in burned acreage from wildfires, have a look here, as most of these years are in tandem, full decades even, while 2020 is represented at the end here as just 2020. It is not in the 2020 decade yet. And as you know, we can estimate that that portion of the graph has gotten larger. To expand on 2020, CAL FIRE has compiled these stats, and you can read through them. This indicates significantly higher in 2020 than following years. And I can show you in 2024, the burned acres are at the highest, while the destroyed structures are at the lowest. Take that with you as you learn. Wildfires can be extremely destructive. Yeah. So the fire hazard severity zone map assigns a hazard ranking based on fire likelihood and fire behavior. evaluating criteria such as fire history, existing and potential vegetation for a 30 to 50-year time horizon, local climate topography, and ember production, and blowing. There are 3 levels of hazard in the state responsibility areas: moderate, high, and very high. You can search areas by address. And you can also, it's available on CAL FIRE sites, and you can see it the whole state. Okay, and the severity, the very high fire hazard severity is identified within local responsibility areas. So those responsibility areas are displayed as via the state, via localities, regions, and the full US, the federal responsibility. The Santa Monica Mountains, I know, are both a federal responsibility as well as a state responsibility, while the areas surrounding it are local responsibility. So that's actually a really fun map. I suggest everybody goes and researches their own area to see who is responsible for the mitigation and for protecting their area. So California State Parks has developed a well-balanced process to address these forest fuel managements. Part of their practice includes wildfire management planning, vegetation management, fuel modification, plus services such as training, policy development, and more. They do not create fuel breaks on its boundaries. Neighboring landowners are offered guidance and in some cases even cooperative action when the defensible space needs align with the department resources and land management goals. Another solution California State Parks offers is the boundary vegetation modification right, or entry permit, which enables landowners to access state park lands to create the necessary defensible space required. As always, California State Parks recommends landowners contact their local fire agency to confirm their property meets home hardening and defensible space guidelines. So here we have the wildland-urban interface. It is the zone of transition between unoccupied land and human development. It offers insight into the risk of the area and the inhabitants of those areas. Three terms that are used within the wildland-urban interface are wildland-urban intermix and wildland influence zone, each representing a different region. However, it is good to keep in mind the primary definition, as these terms are interchangeable. Oh, no. I'm sorry, the wildland-urban interface is dense housing adjacent to vegetation, while the intermix is housing development interspersed in an area dominated by wildland vegetation subject to wildfire. Okay. And the influence zone is wildfire susceptible vegetation up to 1.5 miles from the wildland-urban interface or the intermix. So as you can see in this slide, the wildland-urban interface encompasses extremely large areas. And my apologies, had some barks there. One application of the WUI comes with allowing us to know which communities are at risk. The WUI areas continue to grow by approximately 2 acres per year. In 2018, it was reported that it grew more rapidly from 1990 to 2010 in following areas. Number of new houses grew, land area grew as well. Housing development is attributed to 97% of wildland-urban interfaces growth. And this results in more wildfire ignition, putting more lives and homes at risk. The main point is change is occurring through policy and legislation. Some of the examples of that are shared on this slide. For example, California passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32 in 2006. That legislation has created tens, if not hundreds of legislation help the penultimate. So that legislation helped further legislation get passed through our penultimate goals. When it comes to building code, we recommend building locally, consult local government agencies for ordinance and code requirements. In general, the California Building Code helps demonstrate the technical details for building structures with wildfire-resistant materials and practices. Specifically, Chapter 7A, the materials and construction methods for exterior wildlife exposure, breaks down the materials, systems, and/or assemblies used in the exterior design and construction of new structures with a wildland-urban interface fire area. So I believe I'm going to pass it along to a colleague here.
Hey, everyone. If you didn't get a chance to introduce yourselves in the beginning, my name is Diana. I'm a home ignition zone evaluator with the RCD. Before we get started, my Wi-Fi is a little bit low, so I'm going to turn off my camera just to avoid any interruptions, and then I'll hop back on. So we're going to begin by talking about some myth busters. Next couple slides. So the first question is, when wildfires occur, do structures or vegetations perish first? What is more likely to add fuel to the fire, structures or vegetation? Next slide. It's important to understand that these fires get out of control mostly due to human influence. And that much of the driving fuels of wildfires are man-made structures, not vegetation. While some plants are more readily combustible than others and can make the situation worse, generally well-maintained and hydrated vegetation is a form of resilience, not a weakness. Consider these two examples from the Paradise Fire. Can you tell what's standing and what's been destroyed? How is that structure, or how is that the structures perish, but the vegetation remains? This tells us that embers were the source of ignition to those structures. What can we do to prevent these structures from igniting? Next couple slides. So we're going to talk about how homes burn. So a home can ignite and burn from any one of these three different sources of wildfire exposure during a wildfire, which is windblown embers, radiant heat, and direct flame contact. Next slide. So flying embers are wind-driven embers from a home or wildfire can destroy homes miles away without igniting anything in between. They're responsible for up to 90% of building ignitions. They are the greatest danger when they can gain access to a home's interior. With the Santa Ana winds, embers are our greatest concern for home ignitions. Next slide. Radiant heat. High heat from proximate fire can ignite some home exterior materials. It can also compromise windows to gain access to highly flammable home interiors. If there's a source of radiant heat nearby, external building material can be damaged, such as vinyl siding. Next slide. Direct flame contact. A wildfire front can overtake a home. The flaming front of a wildfire moves so fast that it is less likely for a home to ignite from direct flame contact. Next slide. So let's take a look at some vegetation management. In this section, we're going to focus on fire resistant construction. We'll dive deeper into vegetation management in the next section. Fire resistant construction. Next slide. Sorry. Roofing and vents, Class A fire rated roofing products such as composite shingles, metal concrete, and clay tiles offer the best protection. Inspect shingles or roof tiles and replace or repair those that are loose or missing to prevent ember intrusion. Box and eaves, but provide ventilation to prevent condensation and mildew. Roof and attic vents should be screened to prevent ember entry. Decks and porches. Never store flammable materials underneath decks or porches. Remove dead vegetation and debris from under decks and porches and between deck board joints. Siding and windows. Embers can collect in small nooks and crannies and ignite combustible materials. Radiant heat from flames can crack windows. Use fire-resistant siding such as brick, fiber cement, plaster, or stucco, and use dual pane tempered glass windows. Next slide. When fire experts visit communities after a fire has scorched the region, they're always collecting and processing information. Sometimes they're surprised. Many times they observe something that confirms why home hardening makes a difference. The image at the top represents an association type of community where certain homes resisted the fire and did not ignite despite the fact their neighboring homes were completely engulfed. The image at the bottom represents a completely scorched region where the structure resisted igniting because the homeowner adopted the practices being shared here. What do you think was the difference in the cases? The fire professionals that walk sites like this have made observations and recommendations for all of us to follow. Next slide. Now let's take a look at relative costs and priority level. So relative cost indicates the relative cost of upgrading the listed features of ember-resistant material and design. The priority level indicates the features most vulnerable to wildfires and embers. Keep in mind each situation is unique and may change your priority level. Next slide. Here are some case studies and research on this topic you can explore once you receive a PDF of this slide after taking the course. Next slide. So just a brief overview. The idea is that the material needs to withstand fires and the associated heat and not make the fire worse, so that the material can't melt, can't readily transmit heat, and can't combust. Non-combustible refers to material that is wholly resistant to igniting and burning when in contact with fire. Materials passing the ASTM E136 is considered non-combustible. Ignition-resistant material, it's a material that resists ignition or sustained flaming combustion sufficiently so as to reduce losses from wildland-urban interface configurations under worst-case weather and fuel conditions at wildfire exposure of burning embers and small flames. Materials must meet these requirements: extended ASTM E84, UL 723, test or ASTM E2768, non-combustible material or fire retardant treated wood. The images shown here are examples of some of the experimentation that goes on when determining the standards and performance of materials and structures. The image at the top is a chamber that evaluates materials to determine if they meet the requirements to be considered an ignition-resistant material. The second image demonstrates a vertical furnace that tests the performance of wall assemblies. Next slide. So just a brief overview. Sorry, I had a glitch. So as we explore the various areas of the home, the information will follow a general format. Some background information, including codes, standards, and sources. We provided some links so you can review in the depths afterwards. What you need to do, what to be mindful of, and the importance of maintenance. Out of sight, out of mind. The greatest trick the devil ever played: stay sharp, stay attentive. Be mindful of new buildings, new build versus upgrading. Codes do change over time. Always review the latest edition. Next slide. So here we have a case study by Thought Leadership Series, Reducing California's Fire Risk. It was brought out June 22nd, 2021, and the tour is led by Amy Sims of Plant Prefab. Sorry, is it my internet or is it playing?
It's glitchy, but keep going. We got you back.
Okay. So code requirements, offsite builders like Plant Prefab on the site construction professionals have to build the same standards: California State Building Code, CBC, any supplementary amendment, including by the local municipality. Chapter 7A of the CBC specifically addresses all new construction in any fire hazard severity zone and wildland urban interface areas. The WUI classification describes set of conditions that architects and builders must adhere to. Code establishes minimum standards for the protection of life and property to resist the intrusion of flames or burning embers, reduce the spread of fire from source to dwelling, then from dwelling to dwelling, offer some protection that if the home catches on fire, building occupants have time to escape. Fireproof home isn't really achievable, but multiple areas can be designed to mitigate risk.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I think we could skip over to the next slide. The video is not working. So let's talk about roofs. The photo from IBHS demonstrates on the left an example of minimizing ember entry by installing a metal drip edge to seal off the gap. And on the right, evidence of an ember intruding into the attic at the intersection of the top of a fascia to roof sheathing. The photos from UCANR demonstrate the risk that's associated with the vegetation that overhangs the roof. In the middle of the photo, it's pretty clear that the trees are within zone 0, which in itself is an issue. And while at the bottom of the trees don't overhang, they're close enough that the leaves and debris regularly lands on the roof. Next slide. You'll all have access to these links when you get the PDF copy on the slide deck. Next slide. what do we notice here? There's, a lot of vegetation and none of it's on fire, but the structure is. Next slide. So in this case study, Defensible Space Project demonstrates sensitive ways of buildings in the wildland urban interface. Ryan, can you hit play? So is there sound?
Yes.
Sorry, everyone. Maybe it's just my computer.
Very important. Anytime you have a
It's
site wall
working.
that connects to a building.
Can you all hear that okay?
No, we don't hear anything.
Okay, maybe we'll just skip over to the next slide. Let's talk about vents. So the image refers to the golf tee test. If the tee does not fit through the mesh openings,
That is
all you need to finish.
construction.
Next slide. So Vulcan vent, which has a honeycomb matrix sandwiched in between screens. Second is the fire guard vent, which combines a screen and a fuse link device that, when activated, closes the vent with a metal door. Lastly, in a branded guard vent, which has a baffled design that is ideal for attic vents and eaves or cornices. Next slide. Here are the standards for vents and the NFPA fact sheet. So let's test out this video, see if it works. Can't hear any sound.
You might have to click share sound in the
Below to
audio.
right, you can see that we have a
Yeah,
foundation.
when Ryan
simulated
unmuted himself,
foundation
we could
bed.
hear
It's actually
audio
not a
now.
foundation bed, condition, but two manufacturers specialize in ember resistant venting that used here. So one is O'Hagan and the other is Brand Guard, and they both offer a number of different products for different venting conditions.
Did that help?
And that's important to know for more serious vent replacement or new construction, that those products exist
Everybody able
and
to
are
hear me?
tested and excellent products. However, for those people who live in
Yes,
the
it's great.
mountains here and have venting conditions that are larger than a 1/4 inch mesh, we actually recommend that a high effectiveness fix on your ignition zone is to simply overlay those vented conditions with an 1/8 inch steel mesh or smaller than that. Now you do need to be careful. Venting is there for a reason. You don't want to close up vents, but an 1/8 inch is what's recommended. These manufactured vents actually use some interesting techniques of interlocking, almost like flashing and ember traps mixed with a steel wool type structure. So they're quite specialized and obviously very effective, but short of re-venting your house, which by the way, both manufacturers will help you with that and help you to make sure that you've got sufficient venting. But short of that, a less costly approach with wind-driven fire season approaching is just to cover those vents, any vent conditions that you have, with something to get them down to an 1/8 inch minimum opening. So on the south-facing overhanging roof here, you can see another fire-safe vent condition. You can almost see inside the baffles and that are part of that. But this is actually another fire-safe vent that is available to work with, in this case, a standing seam metal roof. And it just shows you that, again, with the copper, that all of these features can be integrated into many different design languages. And the reason we focus so heavily on the vents is because that is the predominant point of entry for embers, and many homes effectively burn from the inside out. So to continue our conversation about venting,
Ryan, can you go back to so just to talk about that a little bit, you know, basically just talking about vents. There's 2 manufacturers that specialize in ember-proof venting, which is O'Hagan and Vanguard. So you can use these for vent replacement or new construction. Both are excellent products. Recommend a high effectiveness fix to overlay vented conditions with 1/8 inch mesh, which is another copper venting example. So yeah, sorry for all the video trouble. Do you guys have any questions?
I have one. With passive house construction, you're controlling the ventilation. And so you don't have these vents, this pressure change in the house sucking in embers. Do you know of any studies that have looked into passive house construction and fire? I'm part of a steering committee where we are trying to get voluntary passive house construction as a alternative pathway on Title 24, just so you don't have the double work. And we really want to make this information known when we talk to the legislators and everyone else. And we've been looking for firefighters that are on board with this. I mean, we know of examples where passive houses have survived fires, but we're looking for support, really.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have an answer for you right now, but I can look into that. I'm not sure if IBHS has done any research on that, but I could certainly
Fine passive house.
It's a style of construction that's been around for about 30 years. It originated in Germany, and it's been taking off in colder climates because you barely need any heat to keep your house warm. So states like Massachusetts and Washington already have pathways to get the construction done without having to do the double work. But it also works in the same way in hot areas where you barely need any air conditioning. So if you can look it up, and
It's unvented assemblies then.
well, you control the venting. So the physics does the work for you, and you have the venting happen inside the house. So
Yeah,
you're
so there's
controlling,
no cavity. There's no cavities whatsoever.
right.
Got it. Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, if you could look into that, I can text you my email and that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, if you don't mind sending me your email, then I can get back to you on that. I don't think I've heard of that yet. I'm in California, so.
Yeah, I haven't heard too much about the passive housing and the vents, but any opening that's larger than an 1/8 inch where embers could get into somewhere where there's flammable things behind it, you're gonna want to put some kind of screening. So any gaps like that, they would still need to utilize something to make sure embers aren't getting into the house somewhere and able to burn something.
Any other questions? Alrighty, well, let's take a 5-minute break. We can be back at 6:10.
All right, everyone. Welcome from your break. Hope everyone's doing well. My name is Erza Sarwari. I am a project manager at the RCD with the Community Resilience Department, and I've been doing wildfire evaluations for over 2 years. So I get to give a lot of recommendations for these home hardening and defensible space things to residents. Let's get started with our first slide. So we're going to talk about decks. So SFM standard 127A3 talks about horizontal projection underside. The fire resistance test standard consisting of a 300 kilowatt intensity direct flame exposure to a 10-minute duration. And then 127A4 is about decking. It's a 2-part test, which involves under the deck exposure of 80 kilowatt
I thought you had a lot of homework.
If we could just
Yeah, let's go.
mute our mics when we're not talking, please. Thank you. And so under deck exposure of 80 kilowatt intensity direct flame for 3 minutes. And then the next one is deck upper surface burning ember exposure with a 12 mph wind for 40 minutes using Class A roof test brand. The standard test method for evaluating under deck fire test responsive deck materials, and you'd see the numbers here, and fire test responsive deck structures to burning brands. Decks is one of the most common areas we see issues when we go on these evaluations, so super important. Next slide. So materials must meet performance requirements. They need to be non-combustible materials, lightweight concrete, tile, metal, fiber cement, or fire retardant treated wood. This includes other components such as the joists, the posts, and the railings. The goal is to create a non-combustible zone around and under the deck. Keep a gap of 1/4 inch between deck boards, joist spacing of 24 inches with a fall-faced self-adhering adhesive flashing tape down 2 to 3 inches of each side of the joist. And maintenance is super important, being mindful of the debris collecting in the gaps and removing combustible items on the deck or under the deck. I see a lot of people storing their wood piles underneath the deck or flammable furniture, things like that on top of the deck. So super important. Next slide, please. The 2 photos you see here are from UCANR, and they're examples of decks that have risks. You probably noticed some of those. Even if these decks use all the right materials, there's a challenge posed by the vegetation that's incredibly close and definitely in zone 0. The vegetation will naturally drop debris, and in some cases, the maintenance and removal of that debris will be super challenging. So the more vegetation you have in that area, the more cleaning they're going to have to do as well. Embers can come into contact with that vegetation and make the situation very challenging to deal with. Next slide, please. So we're going to watch a little case study called Fire Rebuild in Malibu on Bush Drive. The original house was lost during the Woolsey fire in 2018.
The roof can be one of the most vulnerable parts of a home to a wildfire. It is important to design this so it is free from debris and has a Class A rating. Any wind-driven embers can touch down on debris on the roof and start a fire. Wind-driven embers can also get into vents and actually start a fire from inside the home. The roof here is flat with a gentle 2% slope, and it is made up of several layers that contribute to give the overall assembly the Class A rating. This consists of fire-rated sheathing and a dense fiberglass layer. One way to help maintain a clean roof is to not have gutters. This home is designed with internal roof drains instead. So water from the roof is directed to the roof drains, which then route the water through the home and ultimately into the yard into specified planted areas. The roof drains are covered with a metal mesh and periodically checked to ensure that they remain free and clear from debris. Eventually, as you see in the model, nearly the entire roof will be covered with solar panels. These roof overhangs and decks that you see here in this image are also vulnerable areas to fire. Open overhangs with exposed roof framing create the possibility for heat to build up between the framed members. Closed, solid overhangs are preferred, as you see here, and all the overhangs are stucco, smooth, and non-combustible. And because this is a flat roof, there is no need to vent the overhangs. This is important as every vent, unless covered with a tight weave metal mesh, is an area vulnerable to ember intrusion.
All right. So now we're going to talk about gutters and downspouts. SFM standard 705A4 is about roofs and gutters. It talks about using non-combustible materials like aluminum, copper, or galvanized steel. Cover gutters with a non-combustible leaf guard so debris doesn't accumulate. Some metal gutters need a drip edge to shield the roof edge from a flaming exposure and minimize the entry of embers into a soffitted eave construction. And you can see in this picture what a drip edge is. Next slide, please. So the two images on the left here are meant to juxtapose. The top middle one shows what happens when there are no gutter guards, the congestion of litter debris inside the gutter. And you can imagine if embers land on that, what would happen. And on the other hand, the image on the immediate left demonstrates a roof with a gutter guard. While the gutter guard prevents the congestion of ignitable litter within the gutter, it is building up on the rest of the roof. So that still needs to be removed. Next slide, please. For windows and skylights, SFM standard 12782 for exterior windows, a fire resistance test standard consisting of 150 kilowatt intensity direct flame exposure for 8 minutes. And then NFPA 257 is a standard on fire test for window and glass block assemblies. The basis here is non-combustible materials, so the windows and its components resist breaking or melting under high heat. The framing should be done with non-combustible materials like metal or metal-clad wood, and exterior window shutters made of non-combustible materials like metal that can mitigate risk because they are unlikely to succumb. Window options are relevant anywhere there are external windows, even small ones like the shower ones or in partitions on the door. Do not use wooden or plastic materials. Do not use plastic glazing or annealed and ceramic glass. Provided by UCNR, the images on the bottom left refer to performance of a single pane window versus a dual pane window. The middle image is a single pane window that is clearly completely destroyed and allowed for the fire to make entry into the property. On the other hand, the image on the left is a dual pane window where the outer pane cracked in the elements. However, the interior pane withstood the elements. Especially if there's vegetation right outside the window, the radiant heat from that vegetation could end up cracking your windows. So it's super important to make sure there's no vegetation near the home or that it's, trimmed so that it's not as much of a risk. Next slide, please. So the image on the bottom left here is an example of a skylight that's vulnerable because the outer layer is made of plastic. For best performance, it's recommended that the skylights consist of 2 layers, with one of them consisting of tempered glass. And obviously screening it off is a good option if you're going to be keeping it open a lot, especially when they're not home. Next slide, please. So says to see image 9 in the handout. The CAL FIRE building materials list. And as always, maintenance. Do not let debris accumulate. Very important. There's a skylight completely covered with leaf litter. Okay, next slide. Exterior doors and garages. NFPA 252 is standard method of fire test of door assemblies, fire resistance rating of not less than 20 minutes. So meeting performance requirements of SFM standard 707A 3.1 is in accordance with ASTM, as well as SFM standard 127A1. This applies to all exterior facing doors and garage doors. So in essence, the door framing and the exterior surface or cladding must be of ignition resistant and non-combustible material. And it's critical to cover gaps to prevent ember intrusion. Installing adjustable weather stripping that meets UL standard 10C on the interior side of the door frame is also good. And next slide, please. If the door has a glass panel, it must meet the window requirements. Same goes for sliding doors or garages with window panels. For garages using ignition resistant and non-combustible materials like metal, you can install weather stripping that meets UL standard 10C. And for the exterior trim, consider fire retardant treated wood or fiber cement board. As always, again, maintenance is critical. Removing debris around the exterior, removing doormats as they're likely made of combustible materials, trimming back vegetation near doors and garages is also very important. Next slide. We're going to look at this case study on a tour of first phase of defensible space project, demonstrating sensitive ways of building in the WUI.
Or the garage door is doing a couple things that are appropriate in a wildfire context. One is that is true divided light construction. So it's insulated glass. So this is demonstrating also what you would do on a large window wall, even if it wasn't a garage door. You see true divided light, insulated glass, and that's important because what causes glass to break is not just the condition of the glass itself, right? You'll hear that single pane glass is a weak point relative to heat and wildfire resistance, and that is true. However, if you have an insulating piece of glass and you do get sufficient heat to break that outer pane, the inner pane has about 30 seconds before it goes to. So what makes glass break is not just that insulating condition or the lack thereof, but also the size of the area. So the differential between the glass that is within the frame and the heat or temperature of the glass at the center of the frame is what causes glass to crack. So smaller pane glass areas collected to make a large area of view is preferable to a large single sheet of glass, whether it's insulated.
So yeah, smaller panes of glass are less likely to break than the larger ones. And so you can see that garage door was all glass, but it was a bunch of smaller pieces making up one large area. Let's see, next slide. We're going to talk about fences. So in general, we recommend non-combustible materials. And if the fence is in zone 0, so that's the 0 to 5 feet from the home, it's necessary to use non-combustible materials. Most of the time we see that a lot of houses have attached fences in 0 to 5 feet that are wooden. So enclosed fences made of concrete, stone, masonry, or metal is preferred. Metal wired fences are non-combustible, but they do little to prohibit entry of embers. If the fence is further out and combustible materials are used, you want to use non-combustible material in the last 10 feet, including the siding that attaches to the exterior wall. Otherwise, the fire has a path directly to the home. Avoid fences that have gaps, as airborne firebrands trap in that space and ignite. Let's see. A fence with greater airflow makes it more difficult for embers to accumulate. For example, a fence with a single panel lattice. A fence with lattice on both sides or privacy fence with planks on one side are flawed and vulnerable. Again, maintenance is critical. Removing debris consistently. If vegetative debris accumulates, the fire can leverage the fence as a horizontal ladder fuel. For exterior walls and siding, the image on the bottom left corner shows the cylinder which the shingles receive fire retardant pressure impregnation treatment. We have SFM standard 12781, exterior wall siding and sheathing, a fire resistance test standard consisting of 150 kilowatt intensity direct flame exposure for 10-minute duration. And then we have one for exterior covering and exterior wall coverings, talking about what materials they need to be made out of, and that the shutters should also be made of non-combustible materials. Next slide, please. ASTM E2707 is a standard test method for determining fire penetration of exterior wall assemblies using direct flame impingement exposure. The images shown here demonstrate experiments to test the performance of exterior siding. The image on the far left is a plain bevel lap joint siding, which succumbed to flame penetration at the joint in 75 seconds and hence failed the test. The second image demonstrates a corner wall. The siding's ignited, that is ignited is made of composite materials, whereas the siding that's perpendicular is made of fiber cement. And the fiber cement charred a little bit, but it didn't succumb to flames like the composite materials did. The third and fourth photos show untreated combustible siding products. And in this example, the fire has penetrated into the lap joint and the stud cavity. The fifth photo shows the condition of vinyl siding from radiant fire exposure from flames 50 feet away. It's looking pretty beat up. The performance of the vinyl clad exterior walls largely depends on the performance of the underlying sheathing. So we'll watch a little case study now about siding, framing, and windows.
Material choices have a big impact on the fire resilience of your home. If the siding ignites, a fire can penetrate the stud cavity and work its way into the home through any air gap, window, or even a dryer vent. By using stucco, a non-combustible material, we are adding another defense layer against embers and potential fire spreading. The next layer of defense beyond the exterior stucco is the framing. In this home, the major structural elements, the columns and beams of the modules, will be HSS tube steel. The remaining infill framing members are a mix of engineered and dimensional lumber. In other words, the overall superstructure is steel, which is more fire resistant than wood. The open trellis areas that you see around the home will be constructed with the same overall palette, a combination of stucco and exposed structural steel for the posts and horizontal members. Windows and glass doors are also vulnerable to fire. If the frame ignites or deforms, or if the glass breaks, embers are now able to enter the home. Multi-paned insulated glass that is tempered creates an additional barrier to ember intrusion. Tempered glass is 3 to 4 times more resistant to high heat than annealed glass. All the windows and doors in this home are insulated and tempered to assist in fire resistance, and the railings at the deck are tempered structural glass. As stated earlier, all vents and openings in the home to the exterior become potential points of entry for embers. For this reason, it was decided to not vent the crawl space the traditional way through the foundation wall. Instead of vents through the concrete foundation, this home has a mechanically vented crawl space, so no debris or embers can enter, and the only access into this area is through the inside of the home. Fire suppression within the home is now a code requirement. This home is designed with an interior fire sprinkler system. Additionally, multiple hoses and hose bibs will be installed throughout the property and the exterior decks that will be long enough to reach the top of the house, so in the event of a localized fire, the homeowners can act swiftly to try and control.
All right, so now we'll talk about eaves, overhangs, and soffits. This photo that you see on the left is by Stephen Corliss. He comes from an from an IBHS experiment that's on open eave design, which demonstrated the flame impingement exposure, the time to ignition, and the lateral flame spread was all worse in this type of design. So next slide. The photo by Wildfire Prepared demonstrates how a soffitted eave looks. And the middle photo by Stephen Corliss, again, demonstrates in part A, open eave construction with vents and blocking, and in part B, gaps between blocking and other wood members in the under eave area. For new builds, constructing without overhangs may be an easier solution. And definitely don't use vinyl, untreated wood, or metal, as they will succumb or transfer heat. So we'll watch a little case study next about walls framing.
Different languages here to show as many different strategies for wildfire resilient construction as possible in this little structure. One of the things you'll notice here is a wall. It's a wall you can sit on, and it is a literal extension of the building wall. This is obviously fire safe and non-combustible construction. That's very important. Anytime you have a site wall that connects to a building, it will need to not conduct fire from the landscape through a flammable site element such as a wood fence to the structure. It's obviously not everything on this surface is non-combustible, right? That in the corner, that corner post is a piece of oak that was salvaged from a deadfall right over there and milled in this corner. And what's important about this is that you can see there's an apron, there's a skirt that's easily cleaned. This pebble finish concrete here, and that is also heavy timber. In addition, the kind of bungalow style elements here are obviously quite beefier than you might have in a typical exposed wood condition. And heavy timber is much more difficult to ignite than lighter construction. So you can see here that everything is the minimum of a 4x dimension, and most is 6x or thicker. Now, the other thing that happens when you do exposed framing is you end up with nooks and crannies, we'll say. What you can see here is that rather than boxing all of those out and losing some of the figure and the scaling that is attractive with such construction, we instead added what we call fire flashing. So this is a heavier gauge steel angle that you can see there. That means that if anything does collect, like a bird nest in that corner, for instance, if that were there, you could literally have an ember set that light fuel on fire and nothing would happen. Even our decking, you can see here, that is not wood decking. That is a lighter gauge cold rolled steel that looks a little bit like patina decking. So again, we're showing that architectural language is possible in an extremely fire resilient condition.
So other standards, the California Building Code Chapter 7A, we have E84 ASTM, standard test method for surface burning characteristics of building materials, E27 68, standard test method for extended duration surface burning characteristics of building materials, It's a 30-minute tunnel test, and these other awesome ones for your future use. And let's go to the next slide. So now we'll talk about assessments and insurance. I believe it's handout 11, number 11 in your handout. Some insurance companies will not take new claims in fire-prone areas. I've been hearing from a lot of homeowners they're having insurance issues. So calling an insurance company is a good way to assess an individual home's wildfire risk. The company can provide a fire line score, property-specific hazard scores based on the risk factors such as fuel, slope, and access, identify risks and vulnerabilities to windblown embers, as well as community level mitigation information and historical wildfire activity. Next slide, please. There are a lot of resources available. We provide a free home ignition zone evaluation. We also have other funding opportunities throughout the year. We're currently in the next few months going to have a home hardening reimbursement, as well as some zone 0 retrofits that we're going to be working on for people. And then we have through USGBC, obviously they have a lot of awesome resources. Their free toolkit for homeowners. IBHS is a great guide. The California Fair Plan is supposed to help with insurance, and I hear that it's been helpful for a lot of homeowners, but not everyone has been able to get it insured under it. So hopefully there'll be something for those people soon. And then you can also look at property-specific wildfire risks. So the next section, we're going to be talking about defensible space.
Can I
So
ask,
yeah, we're gonna,
make a comment?
okay.
Sure.
Yeah, this is Stuart. I was gonna make a comment about double pane windows. While I think that's a good idea, what I've seen is the vinyl framing typically will melt and drop the glass out of its normal position. So it's not always the glass that might break, it's actually the vinyl framing. My other comment is that a lot of people don't have money to change out their windows, and so one easy remedy that's very effective is to obviously move the fuel away from the windows, and that will dramatically reduce risk while costing a lot less.
Definitely. Thank you, Stuart. Both really good points.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're gonna dig in on that defensible space, which is what you're referring to, moving the fuel away from the windows. And the most pivotal is zone 0. But first, let's get into a myth that wildfires occur when wildfires occur, do structures or vegetation perish first? What is more likely to add fuel to the fire, structures or vegetation? So as we see here, the structures have succumbed, but the vegetation is doing all right. So we can assume that there was an entry point that didn't have to do with vegetative fuel. And that brings us into the defensible spaces, removing the fuel away from the structure. For the parking. So zone 0 is the most critical, as it is the closest proximity to the infrastructure. And proper defensible space provides firefighters a safer environment to operate in. In zone 1 and 2, comprising the entire 100 feet of space, AB 3074 will introduce, this was back in 2023. So zone 0 has been introduced by the Board of Fire Protection to secure properties. And AB 338 now requires properties being sold in high or very high fire hazard severity zones to have documentation of a compliant defensible space inspection, like I believe the ones we offer at the RCD. This is a wildfire defense that is extremely important, though definitions can vary. Despite the different names you may hear, the sizing remains the same. So in the left and right images, you can see intermediate zone and immediate zone, which we refer to as zone 0 and zone 1. They are the same approximate amount of feet. Zone 0 is 0 to 5 feet. Zone 1 is 5 to 30 feet. And zone 2 is 30 to 100 feet. And that would be the same no matter what kind of terminology you are using. Residents play a major role. Never think of yourself as just a resident. Defensible space, landscape design, plant selection, and maintenance are massively important to your home survival. That 100 feet of defensible space gives firefighters more time to help other places and helps you more effectively. Within the wildland-urban interface, firefighters often face limitations with terrain and access. Fire department can't be everywhere at once. 100 feet gives more safety to firefighters. Irrigation, pruning, and upkeep of dead material mitigates risk. This is all a part of maintenance. While plants with high moisture content and low dead material are ideal, proper maintenance of wildfire-prone species gets rid of risk. All plants can and are flammable, so once you've chosen your fire-resistant species, you must continue to be alert for that maintenance. Zone 0 covers the first 5 feet from the building. As you can see, this barbecue grill is within zone 0, as well as this furniture and these perennial grasses as well. Because of its proximity and positioning to the structure, it is the most important. The first 0 to 5 feet around the house has the greatest impact on reducing the risk of losing a home to wildfire. The solution is to design this area to keep fire and or embers from igniting material that can spread to the structure. Effective strategies include removing whatever may catch, clearing decks, gutters, and porches, and clearing branches as well, as those can act as a ladder. In this area, we don't want any combustibles. So all firewood and lumber, fences and gates. Avoid petroleum-based products, which generally include waste collection carts and patio furniture, like we saw. Yeah. Vehicles should be moved away from this zone. As well as, tree bark or mulch. Zone 1 covers the 5 to 30 feet extending from the building structure outward. In this zone, well-watered is perfect for extinguishing embers, slowing the fire spread, maintains separation of distance between trees and shrubs that could catch fire, as well as patio furniture, wood piles, and swing sets. Planting natives that are consistent with the fire department requirements aids, as well as ground covers and shrubs with occasional small tree. An occasional small tree is preferred, as well as drip irrigation systems. Otherwise, the priority remains the same: maintenance and limit items that can be made combustible. Because homeowners may have adopted an out of sight, out of mind approach, remove all things that may come seasonally, tree branches that hang over the roof, trimmings, and definitely keep them away 10 feet away from the chimney as well. Remember to maintain flammable plants by pruning or removing from this area as well. Zone 2 represents the region of 30 feet to 100 feet beyond the building. In this zone, you want to reduce the fuel and thin it out, plant natives that are consistent, maintain horizontal and vertical spacing, maintain grass so it's a maximum height of 4 inches. All exposed wood piles must have a minimum of 10 feet of clearance down to the bare mineral soil in all directions. And when using, try not to use heavy equipment or removing vegetation down to bare soil, as that can cause erosion and destabilize hillsides. Between the ground and the base of the tree, maintain 6 feet of clearance. Make it a priority to keep extra vertical space between vegetation. When vegetation is not spaced properly, the fire can intensify and move the ground to the treetops exponentially, almost like climbing a ladder. The recommended formula for vertical spacing is 3 times the height of the underlying vegetation. So an example here, a 3-foot shrub needs 9 feet of clearance between it and the lowest branch. Like vertical spacing, the goal here is the same. This is horizontal spacing. Trees 5 to 30 feet from the home need 10 to 18 feet of space. Trees 30 to 60 feet from the home need 10 to 12 feet of space. And trees 60 to 100 feet from the home need 6 to 10 feet of space. Spacing on a slope is similar in terms of the goal. To interrupt the fire's path and keep flames smaller and on the ground, the spacing between trees and vegetation is greater on a slope. So to prevent a continuous path, the spacing between trees and vegetation is greater on a slope. So try to prevent a continuous path of fuel for a fire. Placement of plants when landscaping is just as important, if not more important, than the type of plants. Remember how native plants can act as a barrier. Fire will use poorly spaced shrubs as a ladder to climb to the canopy, causing crown fires. Preventing crown fires means the difference between a wildfire as a tool and a wildfire as a disaster. So trees can be a protector, and trees can also be an accelerant. On one side, they absorb UV rays and and offer oxygen and shade, which is important for us and as well as the plants beneath them. While other trees and plants can act as a ladder for fires to climb onto houses and to spread. Crowns of trees, the tops, should be at least 10 feet away from the house, where overhanging limbs over structures should be cut. This image is an example of an overhanging branch that is over the house, and we recommend that it should be removed. Yeah. When it grows leaves, those leaves may eventually fall and add as fuel to the roof there. Regular pruning is a good practice. And a choice of fire-safe plants should also include trees. And palm trees are invasive to the state as well as massive fire accelerants. They really should not be planted, especially in high or very high likely zones, fire severity zones. So here we'll watch a little video on the tree canopy.
Landscape. So now we're going to focus on the tree canopy, and what we see from the neighbor's house here is a eucalyptus tree. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, the eucalyptus trees are notorious for dropping a lot of leaves, bark, depending on the time of year. And so probably one of our biggest maintenance things is cleaning up after that on a regular basis, both in the landscape as well as on the patios.
And you can see even this neighbor's looks like a Class A roof has leaf litter. And then you contrast that with these much denser green native oaks that can act as ember blockers, as Eric was talking about before, to the very open eucalyptus. You can see the contrast there and how they would function so differently. And here you have sandwiched by two roofs. You've got a tile roof here. Does that collect with leaf litter, Gary?
Yes, that has quite a bit. I'd say once a year at least they get that cleaned off, and our neighbors do a good job of keeping the trees trimmed at least annually, which I think helps some as well.
What about in the garden with the leaf litter?
Oh, the garden. Well, the bioswale particularly, which I think maybe you haven't seen yet, collects quite a bit, so that needs to be cleaned regularly. And not a lot falls on our roof, so that's helpful. We do keep that swept off a few times a year, but I don't see a lot of gathering on the roof.
And Eric, I saw a lot of mulch in the garden. How does that function with the leaf litter? Everyone always asks me about this.
Yeah, and we do use drip irrigation, so we keep the ground moist, but through that, the mulch actually helps collect the leaf litter and help it actually to decompose rather than just sitting on the top.
So it wicks it right up.
Right.
Right, as you heard there, the eucalyptus, which came from Australia, it sheds its bark and produces a lot of fuel, where the native oak actually can deter embers from entering and are fire resistant as well as drought resistant, though all trees are going to need some form of maintenance. CAL FIRE offers a defensible space assessment that helps guide property owner and operators to make the necessary changes. The form on the right demonstrates Zone 1 and Zone 2. Right now, CAL FIRE recently developed Zone 0 requirements. Additionally, AB 38 requires the sale or transfer of a home in a fire hazard severity zone to be compliant with these defensible spaces. Take another look. This is a thought leadership, reducing California's fire risks.
Yeah. Ron, I know the fire departments, both CAL FIRE and the county, they do a lot of post-fire assessments. Are these reports something that can be used by builders and developers to sort of take home lessons around what works and what doesn't work?
Formalized reports, typically, a lot of that is internal for us to learn from, and then from that learning, that's where we would share it. What we found in many cases is the same thing that everybody else is seeing. If we have, and I think Amy mentioned it, if we have areas where, particularly with the landscape, we've got high moisture content and some reasonable defensible space, and we've lost a structure, then there's some indication of why, right? It's not related to the landscape so much as the structure's risk, right? So when we see an entire landscape burn and a structure burn, then we're kind of looking for answers to what happened there, because we don't really know. The other issue is, did we have firefighters there at the time, right? Was there somebody actually going to protect the structure? Did they actually have the defensible space created where they've done, you know, the weed whipping and they've limped things up and we separated continuity? Did all those things happen prior? With our defensible space inspection program, I would like to be able to 100% say, yes, that was all in place before it happened, before the fire. But that's always something that we have to ask ourselves, you know, what are the conditions when the fire burned through? And what do we need to do to correct to make sure that we have a house standing and nobody got injured? So those are always the questions. And it's something that we continually learn from after every single fire.
And I'm just going to press you on this to make sure I heard your answer. So for architects and builders, those reports really aren't available for them to drill down to some of these kinds of answers. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't think the analysis is strong enough yet. We need more data.
Yeah.
And it's funny, you know, we've got a fuel modification unit that does defensible space planning for all new construction. So John is very familiar with it. Clark is very familiar with it. I'm sure Amy and Mackenzie as well. So we have a unit that does that. That's their primary role, right? But what happened after the fact? And we're still learning, particularly in the Woolsey, because there were a number of fuel modification structures that we lost, right? And so we have to go back and find, we don't have all of the data back yet, even though it's been 2 years. And so that needs to happen. That's one of my focuses here as the division chief, to make sure that we have that data so that we can use it and analyze it and come up with what really happened and what kind of solutions that we have to implement. Just anecdotally, we know the things that work, right? The first 5 feet, the home itself, right? And what Clark mentioned earlier about why LA County might have different distances for defensible space. So LA County, Santa Monica Mountains in particular, have probably the most dynamic fire environment in the world, right? With slopes and fuels and topography and the weather that happens over the mountains. So because of that, LA County has a 200-foot minimum at times. And when you look at fire behavior, and that's why I talked about fire behavior analysis earlier, when you look at fire behavior and the ability of a firefighter to defend, and you're looking at the common, just really common, 60-mile-per-hour winds, 30% slope, right? A line northeast wind. When you have those conditions, the flame lengths you're going to get out of a fuel model 4, which is what we have, that chaparral condition out there in Santa Monica's, you're going to get 100 to 125-foot flame lengths, right? So if you only have 100 feet of distance, you're going to have flames hitting the structure, right? That's why LA County has 200 feet, right? Because we can't put firefighters in front of that structure to defend it, because they can't be in flame lengths that are over about 3 to 4 feet. So, right, and so we have really high scorch distances. That's about 1,800 feet, right? From where the fire is to where it's going to hit the structure, we're going to get scorched, and so firefighters just can't be there. So all of those things come into play, and like you said, Mark, we're always looking at trying to get the right data to make the right decisions and really have good understanding, so that when we implement ideas, it makes sense, right? We're doing the right thing to protect both the structure and the environment and the people that are there.
So for post-fire assessments, we should be asking, what were the conditions when the fire burned through? Were there firefighters there? How was the defensible space? And there are some things that we just know to be true, like focusing on the first 5 feet of the home is the most important. LA County has a fuel modification unit where defensible space planning for all new construction is taking place. This is also why insurance companies have backed away from California, because the previous construction did not include defensible spaces. LA County is a little unique because it has the most dynamic fire environment in the world due to slopes, fuels, typography, and weather. So these are all things to be aware of. For the landscape designs, generally, we have native plants that retain moisture and are fire resistant as well as drought resistant. We space them well around, sometimes a typical mulch may include what falls from the oak tree, the wood chips. Those would be preferable mulches, as well as a drip irrigation, so that foliage does not ignite. Always clean excess vegetation, debris, and weeds, as invasive plants like mustard will pop up in any patch of dirt at any time of the year. So it's really important to remain vigilant and remove them because they may be in the wrong spot in the wrong time. Here in this graphic, we have plenty of a number of native plants that would be a lovely addition to a garden, as well as a barrier for defensible spaces. California native plants are best for wildfire resilient gardens, as they shield, they're ember diffusers, and they're slope stabilizers. So in California, our native plants, they need a lot of water, and so they dig deep into the ground to retrieve it, giving them these very big roots that help stabilize the ground, prevent landslides and hillslides, where our invasive species like mustard, they will just take from the surface water. They have very frail roots that they're plants that are very easy to deroot up from the ground, and they actually aid and accelerate landslides as they do not protect the soil from moving downwards from gravity. So leafy green and ideally well hydrated canopies of native trees like the coast live oak right here. This is maybe a valley oak. Can be excellent shield for our house against embers. Remember, the most common igniter to a house is a wayward ember from a nearby wildland fire. So planting something that will intercept them is a good practice. This doesn't only apply to tree canopies. Embers can also be blown along the ground, creating the danger of getting trapped under a patio or wood pile and igniting the whole structure. This is why defensible spaces are really important. Vast empty spaces of land are sometimes called ember bowling alley. We want to avoid these, so planting evergreen ground cover like coyote bush can give you some peace of mind, while embers will be put out by them as long as they are well maintained. Finally, many California native plants have long, deep roots like toyon, which is also referred to as the Christmas berry. They produce these bright red berries that are not edible, though some people can cook with them. This allows stabilization for the dry and often landslide-prone slopes of Southern California landscape. Wildfires accelerate the soil erosion process on these slopes, meaning you will need as much help as possible ensuring that no mudslides will be triggered post-fire. I believe a colleague is going to come on and share about hardscaping and equipment maintenance.
All right, everybody, let's talk about hardscape and equipment maintenance. So next slide. All right, so hardscape, the hard features of a landscape such as pathways, gravels, gravel and pavers. Stone walls, patios, pathways, and other hardscape features can be designed to create fire-resistant zones. Embers can light fire on hardscape. Debris, weeds, dead plants are present. Keep hardscape features clear of litter and clutter to mitigate fire risk. Next slide. So hardscape strategies by defensible space zone. So we have our zone 0, which is 0 to 5 feet. Use non-combustible materials for hardscape design, gravel, pavers, concrete, decomposed granite. Remove vegetative debris. Consider relocating garbage and recycling bins outside of this zone. Zone 2, which is 5 feet to 30 feet. Keep tree branches at least 10 feet from the roof, window, chimney, and other trees. Relocate wood piles to zone 2, which is 30 to 100 feet. Create a separation between trees, shrubs, and items that could catch fire, patio furniture, wood piles, swing sets, etc. And your zone 2, 30 to 100 feet. Exposed wood piles must have at least 10 feet of clearance. Create fire breaks with driveways, walkways, and patios. Distance attached structures, garage, pump house, pergola, at least 50 feet from the house. Maintenance, don't let debris accumulate on any hardscape features. I wanted to add, a lot of the times when we go out and do evaluations, I notice that people have, their barbecue propane tanks right along, the zone 0. You always want to have propane tanks more than 10 feet away from the house. Oftentimes I'll see like gas containers. Try to keep those far away from the house as well too. Next slide. So here's a map that shows prevailing winds, Santa Ana winds in Southern California. Do any of you live in Camarillo? No? Devastating what's going on right now. It's a result of Santa Ana winds.
Just a quick comment. For those of you who don't have Watch Duty, it's a free wildfire alert app that you can add to your phone, and it will give you updates on that fire and fires in 13 states.
Yeah, it's a very resourceful tool. Next slide, please. So we'll watch this case study. It's a fire rebuild in Malibu.
Let's start by looking at the design of the home itself. On the screen now is a site plan for a fire rebuild in Malibu on Bush Drive. I'm going to walk you through the planning and strategies that go into designing a fire resilient home. The original home and much of the landscaping on this lot was lost during the Woolsey fire in 2018. The owners came to us with a request to design and build the most fire-resistant home possible for them. The home is only one portion of good fire-resistant design. Being that this is a large lot, equal value must be given to both the home design and the site design, because any vegetation that grows on this lot affects the neighboring lots. Overgrown vegetation between the yards is an invitation to the spread of a wildfire. Particular placement of hardscape and softscape is key to creating a strong fire-resilient home. The new home maintains the original footprint, but with Ray Cappy's design, the previous traditional one was transformed into a true California classic with a strong connection of the exterior to the interior. During a wildfire, homes can be threatened by wind-blown embers, radiant heat, and direct flame contact. In wildfire events, 60 to 90% of home loss is due to embers. Embers are important because of what they can do directly, like ignite materials inside a home by entering through a vent, or indirectly, like igniting a wood pile close to the home. The defensible space is the area around your home that can literally be used to defend against fires. It is divided up into 3 distinct zones, from 0 to 100 feet away from the structure. After designing the home, the consideration of this defensible space, the buffer zone, is critical to the overall project strategy. Zone 1 is the first 5 feet away from the home. The objective of this zone is to keep it ember resistant, free from plants and debris. For this project, we extended that zone to 20 feet with a mix of concrete patios and gravel. This has the effect of creating a moat around the perimeter of the home of hard surfaces that are non-combustible. Zone 1 extends 5 to 30 feet. The objective of this zone is to reduce the spread of any fires from vegetation into Zone 0. By extending the concrete patios into this zone, we are further reducing the potential spread of fire or embers. Bordering the patio areas are some raised concrete planter boxes that are designed for plants like aloes, ceanothus, and fuchsia, which tend to be high moisture content plants when well maintained. And finally, Zone 3, 30 to 100 feet away, is considered the reduced fuel zone. For this particular project, there's no plan for landscape at this time in this area, with the exception of some ground cover and more gravel.
So this photo shows an example of non-combustible outdoor furniture. So trash and recycling containers relocate to a garage or out of Zone 0. We sometimes tell people to create a red flag checklist, but sometimes it's just better to relocate it to another spot so that, when the red flag warnings come, it's not something that you have to worry about. So patio and deck furniture store inside the home or at least 30 feet away from the building. Choose furniture made out of non-combustible material. Ensure flammable objects such as brooms and doormats are placed inside the home. Propane tanks for barbecues are vulnerable, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So the photo shows an image of a post-fire landscape with large propane tanks located away from the structure with defensible space created by removing vegetative debris from the ground. Fuel tanks on the property risk combustion from direct flame, radiant heat. To mitigate risk, follow all local code requirements for tank placement. Generally locate tanks at least 30 feet from the main house. Create defensible space to mitigate combustion due to potential radiant heat exposure. Consider storing underground or on non-combustible pad. Next slide, please. So here we have exterior sprinkler systems. Exterior sprinkler systems can be mounted on the roof, on the eaves, on the property facing the home. The performance of these systems varies based on variables such as wind conditions, water availability, and radiant heat. Only effective when areas where embers will land are kept wet. So treat exterior sprinkler system not as sufficient but supplemental to other wildfire mitigation strategies. What's going to happen if you have a sprinkler system going, you got a Santa Ana wind that's 70 miles per hour, it's just going to blow in the other direction of the house, but it can aid in, mitigation. Next slide, please. So it is important to maintain safe pathways for emergency vehicles and first responders to have clear access in the event of a fire. The photo on the left demonstrates an example from the International Code Council on fire apparatus access roads, while the middle photo demonstrates an inward opening gate. Make note of the overhanging vegetation that has not been trimmed and would get in the way. Next slide, please. So here we have a video. Again, it's the fire rebuild in Malibu on Bush Drive.
Back to Zone 0 in our ember-free area, the placement of trash and recycling can make a big impact. By locating those items inside the garage, we are reinforcing the concept of a debris and clutter-free zone around the home. And lastly, giving free and clear access to your property to the fire department is a code requirement. Because of the size of this lot, it was easy to create a driveway that has 2 means of entry, which could allow the fire department to get onto the property from either side. The radius can accommodate the truck to be able to enter one end and exit the other. This ensures the 150-foot reach for their hoses is met. The concrete moat that we've created around the home also ensures a clear path at all times for this access when needed. Now let's pivot and talk about what needs to be done when you're actually building the home. Currently, we don't have any WUI projects under construction in the factory. We have many fire rebuilds, like the SketchUp model I shared with you earlier, that are in various stages of permitting. So instead, I wanted to draw a parallel between cold climate construction and fire resilient construction in the sense that both need to keep the elements out. Obviously, fire, we're keeping embers out. Cold climate, we're keeping out cold weather, air. So our tight sealing of that exterior wall assembly is super critical. We're sealing doors and windows. We're sealing all the penetrations, just like we did with fire resiliency. This particular module, we're showing exterior siding. It does get installed when it's appropriate based on the design. We're using the zip system as our exterior sheathing and weather barrier. In the instance of a fire rebuild, that would be replaced with LP flame block. You can see here another closed soffit on the roof. Now we're going to go inside. This is a ground floor module. This is a mud room, so they've got some sink, laundry down here. We're now standardized on type X 5/8 drywall everywhere on the interior, whether it's a fire rebuild or not. We think that's really important to the overall design. We're sealing all the windows, you can see here in this image. And then lastly, what you'll see is the finished product. There's a lot that you're not seeing in this. I know that was a lot to cover in one short period of time, so I've tried to summarize all the key points here in one slide. Not all architects and builders working in California are familiar with all of these principles, so if you're working on a home design, I strongly encourage you to consult with an architect and builder like Plant Prefab, who does have extensive experience designing and building fire resilient homes.
So for fire recovery, I'm going to hand over the mic to Arizo.
Hello again. So we're going to talk about fire recovery. Let's see. Ooh. So post-fire checklist. Before entering a burn site, you're going to want to wear protective gear. You're going to want to seek professional help to remove potentially toxic materials. And minimize foot traffic, equipment, and disturbance on the burn landscapes. Activity on slopes will increase the likelihood of erosion, so you definitely want to be careful of that. You want to consult a professional to determine whether you need to install soil stability measures, slow water from channeling on slopes, prune back and give fire damaged vegetation time to recover. A lot of our native plants can recover from fire. And check drainage systems and clear out culverts, roof gutters, street gutters, infiltration and detention basins, and concrete waterways. Be patient. The lands have recovered many times after wildfires. Once human-made debris is removed, the land will heal on its own. In most cases, it just needs time. Next slide. So fire recovery, soil erosion. The roots hold soil together. So recently burned areas are prone to landslides. Debris flow can occur 2 to 5 years after a wildfire. And what you can do to help is leave the mess, keep it under cover, mulch or chips. Use mycorrhizal fungi that'll hold the loose material together if given the right conditions. And minimize disturbance and soil compaction, monitor stormwater runoff, hand plant in the worst burnt places, mulching to protect new seeds, and refer to professionals in your jurisdiction. CAL FIRE assembles a watershed emergency response team that focus on post-fire conditions, and there is a lot of post-wildfire resources out there, some of which are linked on this lesson plan. Let's see. Is there anything else? In bad fires, the burning creates a waxy substance over the soils and makes them hydrophobic, meaning they need more help absorbing water and nurturing seedlings. You can help replace lost roots and ground cover by hand planting seeds in the burnt areas. And let's see, next slide. In the past, when communities were built, there wasn't as much information to process and benefit from. Now that's changed and a lot more resources and information are available. So first, as always, be mindful of that region's history in terms of geographical characteristics, fire patterns, and native vegetation. The world's always evolving. You want to rebuild green with water and energy efficiency in mind. And there are, let's see. Are there any net zero technologies you can apply is what you want to ask, and apply the concepts you learned here. You want to build with your landscaping and defensible space design requirements in mind and apply home hardening strategies from the beginning so you can avoid combustible materials and utilize materials that will not add fuel to a fire. Be mindful of changes in building code or practices and be cautious of where you store products made with combustible materials. Next slide. Thank you. So preparation is key. And when it comes to natural disasters, some say wildfires are easier to deal with than tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes because the amount of steps required to be adequately prepared for wildfire defense is less than that needed for other natural disasters. But leading the effort, governmental organizations from all the firefighting departments to California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, also known as CAL FIRE, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Geological Survey, as well as others. Councils have formed to support activities in their local region, like the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, which helps with education and outreach, home assessments, reducing wildfire fuels, improving evacuation systems, providing grant funding, and more. In our region, we have the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments, or SGV-COG, the Southern California Association of Governments, and a bunch of others. If your community doesn't have this, you can form one. There's fire safe councils and all kinds of great organizations that do this work. Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority is one of the first and was formed in 1991 in response to the Oakland Hills fire. Since then, it's continued to expand, and in 2020 passed a tax increase to increase funding. Also, SGB COG took proactive measures after the Bobcat fire, and recently they secured funding from CAL FIRE. They've just recently started doing home fire evaluations themselves. So look out for grants and other funding opportunities from federal, state, and local governments and agencies. There's also your municipal water districts. There's a lot of different rebates and things that go into this. And then rely on your community-based non-government organizations such as NFPA, RCD SMM, and USGBC LA. We have a lot of resources and we're here to help. And then that's just some of our cool logos. And for wildfire, preparation is key. Firefighter departments, CAL FIRE, Forest Service. Let me see. Oh, we just read that. Never mind. So now we'll go to the next slide. And Theodore Payne Foundation offers virtual and an in-person wildfire resilience training. You can sign up. And RCD SMM offers resources on their website and YouTube around wildfire defense. We also offer some workshops and training, so look out for those. And let's see, do we have any questions? Looking at the chat, so I see John, I'm sorry to hear about your home. Yes, you know, obviously doing all this stuff to your home is important, but also how your neighbors is if they're within less than 100 feet of you, you guys need to work together. And that's something we often encourage when we go on these evaluations. We always bring extra flyers and things to give to people that we're doing evaluations for, to hand out to their neighbors. So instead of them having to tell their neighbor, you know, if they don't have a good relationship, they can just suggest us and we can go over there and tell them the same things. And hopefully the two people on either sides of the fence, or if they know the same information or doing some of the same stuff, you know, that can work as well.
I just had one thing for clarification. This is Jake with O'Hagan Vents with regards to attic vents and E2886 standard from ASTM.
Okay.
The clarification on that is when you read the building code, it refers you to the standard, and the standard talks about exterior vents. But if you read the standard, it excludes off ridge and ridge. It's very difficult, very hard to communicate to jurisdictions. I've been at it for years. And unfortunately, they always admit, oops, sorry, we didn't read the standard. So just to clarify for the group, that when it comes to attic vents in the WUI, only vents that are installed in a horizontal and vertical surface can be tested to ASTM 2886. So there are products that are approved, but cannot be listed with CAL FIRE. So off-ridge and ridge vents will never be listed until the standard is complete. And O'Hagan has had a standard, mirroring an E108 test, for 15 years. So we're still fighting the good fight. I did allude to in a chat that combustibility is a concern, and CAL FIRE has finally addressed that, and the state legislature has finally addressed that with code changes. So in 2026, we will start to see a reduction of combustible products on non-combustible roofs. That would be plastic attic ventilators that can cause risks for firefighters. So I just wanted to share that with the group. I really appreciate the presentation. You guys did a fantastic job.
Thank you so much for sharing and joining us today.
Thank you so much for that. I also saw a question in the chat asking, do we have to remove leaf litter in the gutters because they're a habitat for caterpillars and other invertebrates? I would say if the goal is wildfire mitigation, you should still clear your gutters from leaf litter, as there will be plenty of opportunities for those other insects to reproduce elsewhere. Fires also are helpful for certain insects, which we call pyrophytes, that are fire followers. They actually need the burned wood to lay their eggs, as well as the deceased organisms. So there's a whole complex ecosystem working together with fires, and the goal of removing leaf litter is just one part of keeping that ecosystem in a balance.